Well, thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Lou Garapolo. I'm the chair of the Historic Preservation Commission, and we're really pleased to have Alyssa Frystak, who's Director of Research and Data Analytics for Place Economics. And so tonight, she is going to be talking about arguments to address some misconceptions about historic preservation, including issues such as affordable housing, neighborhood diversity, density, property values, and other related topics. So, Alyssa?
Thank you. Thank you, Lou. Yeah, it's really, great to be here. This is my first time at the Oak Park Village Hall, and it's such an incredible building. I was like walking around taking some pictures and stuff, so it's really great to be here. I also love that you guys have the speaker series. It's really great to, provide continuing education for not only commission members, but also the public. I work all over the country, and we don't always see that in a lot of places. So this is really great to kind of keep up this education in the community. So as Lou said, my name is Alyssa Frystak. I'm the Director of Research and Data Analytics at Place Economics. I also am very involved with Landmarks Illinois. I'm coming up on the end of my 2-year term as chair of the Skyline Council of Landmarks Illinois, which is the young and emerging professionals organization within the larger organization. Ooh. Oh, I think it's stuck. Let's see. Turn off maybe? There we go. Yeah, okay. Okay, so just to get us started, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Place Economics is. Place Economics is a private research firm with extensive experience in the analysis of the economic impacts of historic preservation. So we are based in DC, but we are a virtual firm with all of our colleagues working in different cities. I'm based here in Chicago, born and raised, like I said. Here's a list of our general services that we provide. In my role, I'm responsible for data acquisition and preparation, methodology development, data analysis, as well as researching best practices. So I mainly work with census data, municipal data, and a bunch of other various data sources. I also rely very heavily on GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. There we go, okay. So Place Economics is often hired by city or state historic preservation offices, as well as nonprofits, to conduct studies that measure the demographic, economic, and cultural impacts of historic preservation. Some of the questions that our clients are interested in answering include, what are the general demographic patterns in their historic districts? They're looking to see the ripple effect that historic tax credit projects have in their community. They want to know about job creation from rehabilitation activity. And then some, especially recently, want to know how older housing is meeting affordable housing needs in their community. There we go. While we pride ourselves on rigorous analysis, we also acknowledge that we're only as good as the data that's available. So sometimes data doesn't exist for something that our client is interested in learning about. Sometimes the data exists, but the quality of it is really poor. But in all those instances, we work really hard to try and find other data sources that we can use, or even collecting qualitative data ourselves. We often remind our clients that we're rarely able to provide exactitude down to the 100th of a decimal place, but rather our analysis helps provide order of magnitude calculations and general patterns of change over time. So that's why our mantra when it comes to analysis is that knowing something is better than knowing nothing. Another thing you'll notice throughout my presentation is that we also like to compare historic districts. against data from the rest of the city. So it's really important to remember that data in isolation means very little, but data compared to something else, like the city as a whole or the rest of the city, really provides context for numbers. You may know our work from publications like the Economics of Historic Preservation, a Community Leader's Guide, which is required reading in a lot of historic preservation master's programs. We have also done 2 studies for Landmarks Illinois on their various grant programs. And then most recently, you might be familiar with the report that we conducted for the Illinois SHPO on the state historic tax credit study. So that was in 2023. Sorry about that. So that's a little introduction of what place economics is and what we do. The majority of my presentation will touch on points made in a white paper of sorts that we published back in 2020 called 24 Reasons Historic Preservation is Good for Your Community. I'll also be pulling findings from studies that we've completed all over the country that demonstrate the benefits of historic preservation. All of these studies can be found and downloaded for free on our website at placeeconomics.com under the Publications tab. I think it's probably like 10 or 12, yeah. So the topic I'm going to kick us off with is property values. Property values are often a very touchy subject when it comes to historic preservation, especially historic districting. So Donovan Ripkema, the principal of Place Economics, always likes to point out that when he started doing this work almost 30 years ago, the greatest resistance from the public about creating historic districts was usually something along this line. Was, we don't want to do that. We think that that extra layer of regulation is going to do nothing but hurt our property values. But in nearly every study that's been done, it's been shown that historic designation does not hurt property values. So before I talk about what's going on in this graph, it's important to note the time period that this data represents. In the late 90s and early 21st century, we saw real estate values growing exponentially. And then, of course, we had the really big crash, followed by a period of recovery. So this graph, as well as some of the others I'll present, the time frame captures all 3 of those phases. So this graph represents all 4 of Savannah's local historic districts. And in each case, the property values in these historic districts outperformed the rest of the city. Now, some might say, well, these are all really wealthy neighborhoods and they have a very high quality housing stock. And so it makes sense that their property values would be high. That is true in some cases, but not always. So in this instance, the Victorian district is a pretty wealthy district. You would expect property values to be outperforming the rest of the city. But the Cuyler-Brownsville Historic District is the opposite of the Victorian district. It's a relatively low-income neighborhood with much more modest housing stock. And even that district outperformed the rest of the city. Sorry, I think the mouse goes to sleep. Okay. So moving on to San Antonio, you'll notice San Antonio has a couple different levels of historic designation. There are local historic districts, which you guys are all familiar with, and that's what's most common in most cities. But they also have conservation districts, which are meant to preserve the character of the neighborhood, but they have a little bit less stringent integrity standards and also design review processes. So regardless, property values in San Antonio's local and conservation districts outperformed those in the rest of the city during the same kind of up and down time frames. Those that did the best were local historic districts, while those that did second best were properties in the conservation districts, both of which performed better than the city as a whole.
Can I ask a question? The first 3 years, did it really go down, or is that just an anomaly?
The first 3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the first 3 years. So that shows that the first year or so of that kind of stayed a little bit, this is indexing as well. So this is a method that we use to kind of show deviation from the very start year. So those first 2 or 3 years, it kind of stays a little bit parallel. And then that's when you see this start to diverge a little bit. So let's see, our local historic districts, for whatever reason, they were tracking steadily up, but then they finally overtook the rest of the city. Okay, so, goodness. Now, you guys are all, well, not all of you, some of you might be Historic Preservation Commission members, and I hate to break it to you, but people are not paying a premium for properties in historic districts just for the right to appear before your commission, right? Instead, they're paying for the premium for the confidence and certainty that comes with knowing that the person across the street from them is not going to be allowed to do something to their property that's in turn then going to hurt their own property values. We're all familiar with the 3 most important words in real estate: location, 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 right? But that adage has real economic impact. And the value of real estate does not come from 4 walls and a roof, but rather the value of real estate comes from its context. And the economic role of historic districts is to protect the context within the individual properties lie, and that is where the premium sits. So next I want to talk about a study that we did a number of years ago in Saratoga Springs, New York, that was almost exclusively on property values. Because of this and because of the quality of data that was available, we were able to look at this topic in almost every way imaginable, cutting it all different types of ways. So comparisons were made for both the median and mean by age, by style, by typical house, by total value, by value per square foot, and by rate of change in value over time. In almost every instance, properties in designated local historic districts outperformed comparable properties not within local districts. As you can see here, both the average home value and the average home value per square foot in historic districts was more than those not in historic districts. So we also looked at value by building age, and all of these different categories, cut all these different ways, properties in historic districts always came out on top. So then, because the data was available and we got really curious, and so we were thinking, well, Victorian homes make up a large share of the houses that are in Saratoga Springs historic districts. And so we were thinking, well, maybe it's just that people really like Victorian houses, and so they're paying a premium to be in these historic districts, to be living in these houses. But even then, Victorian houses in historic districts were still worth more than Victorian houses outside of historic districts. So consistently, there is this positive impact on property values in historic districts. So I just want to add and address this off the top. It is true that higher assessed values usually mean higher property taxes. And for those with modest resources or those living on fixed incomes, that can create difficulties. And because of this, many cities have adopted taxation policies that try to mitigate these problems. But the reality is this: rising property values resulting in rising taxes may be a cash flow problem, but it is also a wealth enhancement. So that does not mean that rising property taxes, which cause financial difficulties for some owners, should not be addressed. That should definitely be part of a toolkit. But the short-term cash flow problem is often offset by the increased wealth in most people's largest asset, which is their home. So foreclosure patterns is another metric in which historic preservation has an interesting impact and something that we consistently track at Place Economics. In December 2007, we marked the beginning of what is now known as the Great Recession, and we all know that the real estate market was the hardest hit during that time period. While the recession was officially designated as having ended in June 2009, the real estate market in hundreds of cities didn't start to recover until 3 or 4 years later. So since in the 10 years from the beginning of the recession, 7.8 million homes were foreclosed on. And the rate of home ownerships in the United States is still 5 percentage points below its height of more than 69%, which was reached in 2004. But even at the city level, rates of foreclosure varied greatly from neighborhood to neighborhood. And in 20 cities that we've looked at this metric, foreclosure rates in local historic districts were decidedly lower than the rest of the city. Here again, you'll notice the time frame for both of these graphs includes the time period immediately after the beginning of the recession through the supposed recovery period. Here's the data from Raleigh. Almost 1 in 10 properties were foreclosed upon in the city as a whole. Half that number in National Register districts, and half of that number in local historic districts were foreclosed upon. A similar pattern was seen in Nashville. The rate of foreclosure in Nashville's historic districts was less than that, half of that seen on properties that were outside of local historic districts. Here is San Antonio. Again, the rate of foreclosure in single-family houses was less than the city average in 10 of the city's 13 local residential historic districts. So you might be thinking this, but it isn't that people who live in historic districts never get divorced or lose their job or get into credit card debt. It's not any of those things, but rather there's such a strong latent demand for houses in these neighborhoods, even in market downturns. And so as a result, homeowners who find themselves in financial difficulties often find buyers for their homes before they reach the point of needing to foreclose. So this is another example of how the stability and desirability of houses in historic districts paid another dividend during the recession. So parallel to this foreclosure discussion is strength of historic districts in up and down markets. So as a general pattern, what we've found is that homes in historic districts do better when the market is moving up. They fall later and less steeply when markets decline, and then they begin to recover their value sooner than other neighborhoods. So here are a couple examples of this. We did an analysis of property values in Savannah's historic districts between 1999 and 2014. So this graph shows the up years of that period. As you can see in the upmarket, properties in Savannah's historic districts did better with a more steady increase in value. Now, this graph shows what happened to those properties in the down years. What we see is that the decline started later. Not that the properties didn't go down in value at all, they did. But the decline started later, and the recovery also started sooner than the rest of the city. What we saw in Pittsburgh is another great representation of this phenomenon. In the immediate aftermath of the start of the recession, property values in both historic districts and the rest of the city saw a decline, notably less steeply in historic districts. However, once we hit about 2010, after the recession was officially designated as ended, we see a divergence between what is happening inside and outside of the historic districts. So around that 2010 timeframe, property values in local historic districts began to steadily recover and increase, but property values outside of historic districts continue to drop for another year before they started to recover. So here again, we see that properties in historic districts decrease in value at a lower rate and bounce back quicker during recession and market downturns. So moving on from those riveting property value discussions, everyone loves to talk about property values. In 2019, the number of millennials in the United States surpassed the number of baby boomers. And so that means that for the next generation, that age group will have an outsized impact on how and where cities grow. So any city planning for a prosperous future must consider the needs and preferences of millennials. A recent study or survey from the National Trust for Historic Preservation found that 44% of millennials surveyed wanted to live in historic, character-rich neighborhoods. And national home buying trends also back this up. So here's a graph from the National Association of Realtors, which does a really great job of tracking who buyers are. So despite making up only 34% of home buyers nationally, millennials account for 59% of all buyers of houses built before 1912 and 43% of buyers of houses built between 1912 and 1960. So in Los Angeles, we looked at where people are living by age. As you can see, the line is almost parallel, every place except for right here. So here is the millennial category, and what we're seeing is that there is a greater share of their population living in historic districts than they do in the rest of the city. Here is Nashville. We can see that baby boomers, for them, about the same share live in historic districts as they do outside of historic districts. But millennials disproportionately choose to live in historic districts. We saw this again in Phoenix, where almost 30% of the population in historic districts was of the millennial generation, as opposed to only 23% in the rest of the city. So what we postulate is this. We think that the three C's are driving this decision that millennials are making about housing. The first is character, obviously. The second is convenience. Remember that these neighborhoods and historic districts are often located close to the center of cities where development first started. It's also close to a lot of amenities and transit, things like that. And then finally, the third C is cost. Often, older housing is competitive in cost because of its condition. Millennials are a lot more eager to take on some house updating and things like that than the baby boomer generation might be. So density is often a topic that comes up when discussing historic preservation. Especially in terms of regulation. Planners argue that density is important because it effectively makes use of public resources like water and sewer lines, public transit, police patrols, things like that. We need density for municipalities to be cost effective. And people often argue that historic districts hurt density. But that is just not the case. In nearly every city that we've looked at, we've found that historic districts have a higher population density than other non-designated residential areas of the city. Here are examples of the population density in Phoenix, Buffalo, Frankfurt, and Nashville compared to the rest of the city. Even in Los Angeles, a notoriously low-density city with lots of sprawl, The population density in LA's HPOZs, which are their local historic district equivalent, was about 15,000 people per square mile compared to 10,000 people per square mile in or outside of historic districts. So what is causing this type of result? Historic neighborhoods provide density in three primary ways. The first is that their lot sizes are often smaller. The second is that house sizes are often smaller. And then third, there is a greater variety of housing types. So this allows historic districts to account for density in a more subtle human scale and something that we like to call gentle density. So here are some examples of this. In San Antonio, the average size of a housing unit built before 1960 was about 650 square feet smaller than houses built after 1960. In Phoenix, another city notorious for sprawl, according to the county assessment data, historic districts have a larger share of small-scale multifamily housing than the rest of the city. These structures, which are duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage courts, things like that, they incorporate density into these historic neighborhoods at a scale that is compatible with the existing character. So in Los Angeles, about 69% of the residential structures in HPOZs have more than one housing unit on their lot, and with 39% providing 5 or more units. So this diversity of housing typologies is something we find often in historic districts and older neighborhoods that predate zoning laws that favored single-family housing and effectively made multi-unit structures illegal. Another way historic districts and older neighborhoods are increasing density is through sensitive infill construction, adaptive reuse, and accessory dwelling units. So ADUs, which are sometimes referred to as granny flats, can take many different structural forms, including garage conversions, standalone structures, attic or basement conversions, things like that. In the state of California and LA specifically, they've taken many steps to encourage the production of ADUs to help address affordable housing needs. Back when we did our study in LA, which was a couple years ago now, their ordinance had just gone into effect, and just in the first 2 years of that program, they had nearly 200 ADU permits issued in LA's local historic districts. So neighborhood level diversity is often something that anti-preservation people argue that historic preservation has a negative impact on, things like demographic diversity. You might hear them say, well, historic districts are all white, or historic districts are all high income. We at Place Economics believe that economic, racial, and cultural integration at the neighborhood level fosters healthy, vibrant communities. And we think that the hallmark of any healthy neighborhood is demographic diversity that reflects the diversity of the city as a whole. And so what we found is that historic districts in most places are great mirrors of the diversity that's found in the rest of the city. So what's an example of this? In Los Angeles, their HPOZs are home to a very diverse population. 63% of the residents in HPOZs identified as minority, as opposed to just 49% in the rest of the city. Further, on a district-by-district level, we found that 21 of the city's 35 local historic districts were more racially diverse than the rest of the city. The same is also true in LA regarding Hispanic population. 54% of the residents in HPOZs identified as Hispanic, as opposed to only 47% in the rest of the city. Similar to racial diversity, there is also diversity of income. We also think that it's really important that historic districts have economic diversity that mirrors the rest of the city. Historic districts in Phoenix largely mirror the rest of the city in household income distribution. Historic districts have a slightly larger share of low-income residents, as well as a slightly larger share of high-income residents. But overall, this spread indicates that at the neighborhood level, there is economic diversity within Phoenix's historic districts. Similarly, household income in Buffalo's local historic districts mirrors the breakdown of the rest of the city. However, incomes within their National Register district tend to be slightly higher for whatever reason. Buffalo's median income is $39,677. Overall, 49% of the households in Buffalo's local historic districts make less than the city's median. Just one more example of household income to demonstrate that historic districts aren't just housing rich people. This time in a city that is facing very different challenges than some of those that we've looked at previously. So, like Buffalo, Cumberland, Maryland is considered a legacy or Rust Belt city, which brings its own challenges and struggles. While the median household income is relatively low in Cumberland at just over $34,000, approximately 61% of the households in local historic districts and 59% in National Register districts earn less than the city's median income. So at least in Cumberland, historic districts are housing an outsized share of the city's low-income population. A lot of cities in the East and Northeast lost population in the latter half of the last century, but this has given us a great opportunity to study these cities to see where growth happens when they do start to gain population again. So we often find that when people start to return to cities after decline, it's historic districts that they return to first. Philadelphia is a great example of this. Back when the results of the 2010 census were released, it was really big news that Philadelphia, after nearly 50 years of population decline, had some modest population growth, which was great. But when we dug into the numbers a little bit more, we found that the reality was that historic districts grew by a little over 12,000 people, but the rest of the city still lost population during that time. So DC is where Place Economics is based and also where our principal, Donovan Ripkema, lives. Again, here there was population decline for about 50 years in DC, but between 2000 and 2010, there was population growth. But a disproportionate share of that growth can be attributed to historic districts. So as you can see here, historic district residents make up about 45% of the city's overall population, but 63% of the city's population growth between 2000 and 2010 can be attributed to those local historic districts, or those historic districts. A similar thing happened in Boston. Nearly 23% of Boston's residents live in historic districts, but between 1990 and 2000, 36% of the city's population growth can be attributed to historic districts. So this is something that we see time and again when population growth starts to happen again and people start to return to major cities after periods of decline. It happens first in historic districts. So another issue at the forefront of many cities is housing affordability. Almost every city in the country is dealing with lack of affordable housing, and often historic preservation is vilified. People saying that all these historic districts do is limit access to affordable housing. So here's an example from Miami-Dade County, where we looked at households that were housing cost burdened, which means that they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. As you can see, a significantly lower share of households in historic districts were housing cost burdened than in the rest of the county. And this is true in Miami-Dade for both homeowners and for renters. Another way to assess affordability is looking at housing costs plus transportation costs, which are typically a household's second largest monthly expenditure. So we did this using data from the Center for Neighborhood Technology, who has created an index that factors both of these variables into the equation. So the H+T index is what it's called, sets the benchmark for affordability at no more than 45% of household income when combining housing and transportation costs. As you can see, in Los Angeles, only 49% of the households exceeded that 45% benchmark for housing and transportation costs. But in the rest of the city, over 68% of the households were burdened by their housing and transportation costs. Here again is Buffalo. Remember back a couple slides that showed the income distribution in Buffalo's historic districts. So just to remind you, their income distribution was a great mirror of the rest of the city. So their historic districts are not housing, high income residents that would, not be cost burdened anyways because they're high income. But overall, what we found was that 21% of renter households in the rest of the city are cost burdened, and an additional 32% are severely cost burdened, meaning that they spend more than 50% of their income on housing. However, the share of cost-burdened households in local historic districts is slightly lower, and in National Register districts, they're lower than that. So on the issue of affordability, I want to bring in two other mantras that we have at Place Economics. We really like mantras. The first is that you can't build new and rent or sell cheap, at least without deep subsidies. And then the second is that every unit of older housing lost is a unit of potentially affordable housing lost. So to provide a real-world example of this, I wanted to bring in one analysis that I did a couple summers back in my own neighborhood. This was part of a micro-analysis that we published on our website in a blog post. So in Chicago, we see that a lot of small-scale multifamily buildings are being torn down, and they're either being replaced by new luxury condos or they're being deconverted to single-family homes. So I found a couple of buildings in my neighborhood that I wanted to test those two mantras on. The first was a 1909 three-flat apartment building, and the second was a mid-century five-flat apartment building. And the third was a three-unit condo building that was built in 2018. So these buildings all sit right next to each other, and though they are on a street that has a lot of extant housing with very little infill, this street is not part of either a local or National Register historic district. So what we found when we looked at the assessment data and the rental data was that on a square foot basis, apart from having an assessed value 3 times greater than the 1909 building, the units in the new building also rent for twice as much as those in the 1909 building. So doing a little bit more digging, we also found that the 2018 new build replaced an early 20th century cottage-style three-flat that was undoubtedly providing naturally occurring affordable housing. So even though this was a micro-analysis of only 3 buildings, its findings can be extrapolated, and when situations like this happen again and again over the whole city, it's easy to understand how it can begin a chain reaction that plays out in property values. So we found that it's as simple as this. As long as the market in that area is strong enough, when an older housing unit is torn down, that lot is rarely ever affordable again. And that has long-term implications on the affordability of the entire neighborhood. And then whenever there is discussion of affordable housing, the issue of gentrification is inevitably brought up as well. Especially in larger cities, preservation opponents try to argue that all historic districts do is gentrify neighborhoods. But in Los Angeles, people who are much smarter than we are, researchers at UCLA and USC did a gentrification study. And they developed a methodology that identified census tracts in which gentrification had taken place over the past 15 years. So those gentrified tracts are represented in the orangey red color on this map. And then what we did was we overlaid their map with the map of Los Angeles's historic districts. And what we found was that there was very little connection between the location of these districts and areas that were identified as gentrified. So at least in Los Angeles, there was very little correlation between historic districts and gentrification. So it's not that, gentrification isn't happening in a lot of cities. It most definitely is. But it's just that historic preservation in historic districts is playing a much smaller role than some people would like to make out. Finally, I want to wrap up with a concept that you may be familiar with, which is smart growth. So smart growth is an urban planning theory that emerged in the mid-90s. It set forth a number of planning principles that encourage growth in compact urban centers that are transit-oriented, walkable, bikeable, all those good things. So smart growth has a very specific set of criteria that it advocates for. We've got mixed land use, compact building design, range of housing choices, walkable neighborhoods, things like that. And what we found is that historic and older neighborhoods meet almost all of the criteria and promote smart growth principles. So one of those principles was compact building design. And in Raleigh, as in San Antonio, the San Antonio example that I mentioned earlier, houses in historic districts tend to be smaller and more compact than the rest of the city. Here we see that 76% of the houses in Raleigh's historic districts are under 2,500 square feet, which that's around 2,500 is around the average square feet of a new build today. Another one of the principles is variety of housing choices. In Los Angeles, there's a healthy mix of housing typologies from single-family homes all the way up to 5 or more unit apartment buildings. However, in the rest of the city, the lion's share, 85%, that's a ton, 85% of the housing stock is single-family. In Miami-Dade County, we also looked at commute distances. Here, over 40% of residents in historic districts had a commute time of less than 20 minutes, as opposed to only 25% in the rest of the county. Walkability is another smart growth principle. In Phoenix, we looked at walk scores, bike scores, as well as proximity to public parks. Again, Phoenix is a notoriously car-centric city, but the average walk score of Phoenix's historic districts is 64, which is 23 points higher than the city's average. Historic districts also have significantly higher bike and transit scores at 71 and 47 respectively. We found that 80% of Phoenix's historic districts have a walk score over 70, which is considered very walkable. 92% of Phoenix's historic districts beat the city's overall walkability score, and they all had a higher transit score and bike score than the city's overall scores. So there were just a couple examples, but from what we've seen, historic and older neighborhoods advance all of the principles outlined by smart growth, making them healthy, vibrant, and sustainable communities. So this is another reason why it's so important to keep preserving these historic neighborhoods, because it promotes responsible planning practices such as smart growth. Finally, I just want to finish with a quote that Donovan Ripkema uses often, and it's from Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith. He says, "The preservation movement has one great curiosity. There is never retrospective controversy or regret. Preservationists are the only people in the world who are invariably confirmed in their wisdom after the fact." So I hope that this quote provides some inspiration, as well as the data-driven arguments that I've made this evening, to help you promote and talk more about historic preservation. Yeah, all right, so thank you all for having me this evening. There's my contact information. Like I said, you can download all of our reports on our website for free if you want to learn more about all these different studies that we've conducted. I think we have some time for questions, so I'm happy to try and answer whatever I can.
Most of your study was about other states. What about Illinois or anything more local?
Yeah, so we haven't actually done a report in Chicago. We have done other reports for like Landmarks, Illinois. We also did the state historic tax credit study for the whole state. But yeah, we have not had an opportunity to do a economic impact study in like Chicago or the Northern Illinois region yet. So would love to be able to do that. Anybody else? No? Awesome. Well, enjoy your meeting this evening. It's been great to be here, and yeah, great.